very much. Distinguished Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning to open your proceedings and to help you, hopefully, to shape the discussions over the next couple of days as you consider how the world can navigate the transition to a resilient and sustainable future global system as the one that we've relied upon for decades disintegrates in front of our eyes in a new age of geopolitical fragmentation. As has already been said, I served as the United Kingdom Transport Minister, Defence Minister, Foreign Minister, and Finance Minister, not all at the same time, I hasten to add, one after the other. Between 2010 and 2019, when I resigned just hours ahead of new Prime Minister Boris Johnson taking office, so he did not have the pleasure of firing me. It is, I think, perhaps a testament to the pragmatism of the British system that Boris Johnson nonetheless appointed me to the House of Lords, the upper chamber of the UK Parliament, where I continue to sit to this day. My last years in the UK government coincided with President Trump's first term, and I had the pleasure of dealing with him on several occasions and of working with key members of his cabinet on a regular basis. There were, of course, challenges and a very different style from his predecessor. We saw the first skirmishes of the US-China trade battle. But when I left government in 2019, I had no sense of an imminent threat to the geopolitical order, the rules-based system of global governance overseen by international organizations, with NATO as the bedrock of European defense, and a trade system based on open markets and largely free trade, all of those systems led by the US. Fast forward to today, and we face an era of unprecedented geopolitical change and uncertainty, as the US has transformed overnight from being the guarantor of global stability to the disruptor-in-chief of the world order that it so largely created. A world of policy by social media posts, of protectionism in place of free trade, and of ambiguity in place of the clear commitment to NATO, which has already undermined the crucial deterrent effect on which the alliance is built. Geopolitics is one of the key forces changing the world, but it is only one of the forces reshaping the global economy. It may be tempting for us to see Mr. Trump and the geopolitical turmoil around him as the cause of all the economic and commercial challenges we face. But while he's undoubtedly shaping the geopolitical narrative, some of the underlying drivers of economic change both predate and override even a US presidential agenda. What are these drivers? There are three that I want to highlight today. The first is technology. That includes AI, but it goes much wider. We're on the cusp of a potentially radical shift in productivity for some workers. And here lies the problem. It will not be for all workers. The hierarchy of work will be overturned as once highly regarded and well-rewarded jobs are commoditized, while currently less prized roles will prove more resilient to the assault of technology. Those who lose are already demanding to be compensated by the winners. And those winners will include the owners of capital, as the optimum ratio of capital to labor in the tech-enabled economy changes and labor bargaining power weakens. The logic that drove globalization is challenged not only by tariffs, protectionism, and supply chain resilience concerns, but also by technological innovation that for manufactured goods will steadily erode the economies of scale and the benefits of specialization that underpin the case for trade. The second is demography. For someone like me, raised and educated in the 1960s and 70s, when the demographic challenge facing the world was one of catastrophic overpopulation, it's pretty difficult to conceive how quickly a string of cultural, social, and economic developments have changed that threat into one of catastrophic population decline. By the end of this century, population will be declining in pretty much every part of the world except Africa, as fertility rates collapse to well below replacement levels. Already, many developed and developing countries are facing dramatic aging as a precursor to overall population decline. That spells fiscal danger. Generous, unfunded pension schemes and social spending programs devised in the years of plenty, when the old age dependency ratio was low, are already unaffordable. Public debts piled up when there were growing numbers of working taxpayers will become unsustainable. And worse, the only known antidote to fertility collapse, immigration, is increasingly rejected by host populations. Countries like Japan, that have already experienced sharp population decline without allowing immigration, demonstrate the heavy economic price of such a stance. And the third is climate change. It is almost certainly now too late to avert catastrophic climate change, and the Trump administration's position makes it impossible to build a global consensus to reduce emissions, even as countless thousands of acres of prime US real estate get consumed by wildfires and devastated by hurricanes each year. All the signs are that technological change is going to significantly increase the energy density of the world economy, more than offsetting population decline. So decarbonizing that energy supply will be necessary, whatever the climate skeptics say, and will be economically costly, whatever the energy transition enthusiasts say. In effect, the world will be trading investment in increased output for investment in lower carbon output. That may be a good long-term decision, but it will be painful for citizens who depend on output growth for rising living standards, and painful too for the politicians who have to sell decarbonization to them. The majority of the world that has more or less bought in to the climate change agenda nonetheless oscillates between the competing and sadly often mutually incompatible priorities of energy security, energy affordability, and decarbonization, depending on the geopolitical challenges of the moment. And even the deniers will be forced to invest in mitigation measures against the effects of climate change, including rising sea levels and radically altered weather patterns, even if they don't choose to adopt renewable energy sources. Climate change itself will dramatically increase the risk of great power conflict in the previously inaccessible but resource-rich Arctic. And it will no doubt provoke multiple lesser conflicts over increasingly scarce resources of water and cultivable land. These are structural changes which will shape the global economy and form the backdrop to the geopolitical contest between the power blocs. They cannot be uninvented. So while geopolitics will shape the future of the global economy from the top down, these structural changes and the economic forces they unleash will exert a significant bottom-up effect and will be largely beyond the influence of politicians. Any consideration of the future evolution of the global economic system must consider both the structural and the geopolitical influences which will shape it. Now, I could speak at length about the likely development of the key geopolitical relationships that will shape our world over the next 20 years. China and the US, Russia and China, the US and Europe, and indeed about the flashpoints that may spark conflicts and shape the geopolitical settlement: Taiwan, the Gulf, the South China Sea, the Arctic itself, Europe's border with Russia. But my purpose today is primarily to focus on the economic consequences of geopolitical change. And in that context, I want to focus my remarks on deglobalization and the restructuring of supply chains, on protectionism and tariffs, and the direct economic costs of geopolitical disruption and of an emerging order which looks as though it will be dominated by considerations of resilience and autonomy rather than economic efficiency. I want to start with the phenomenon of globalization itself. What is driving the fragmentation of markets that now appears to be underway? And what does it mean for the global economy? Every undergraduate economist since the dismal science was invented has understood the theory of trade and the efficiency benefits of specialization. And over the last 30 years or so, we've had an unprecedented opportunity to see these theories in practice, close up and at scale. China's entry into the global economy in the early 1990s and the harnessing of her enormous reserves of low-cost labor to become the world's manufacturing workshop is arguably the greatest supply-side shock in economic history, enabling a long period of low inflation economic growth in both developed and developing countries, driving steadily rising living standards, the slowing of which, after the global financial crisis in 2008, has done so much to feed the rise of political populism in both Europe and America. Globalization is the ultimate manifestation of those economic theories, and it happened when it did, largely because of China's entry to the market coincided with a boom in services in developed economies, which shifted the focus from defense of low-value manufacturing jobs to seeking market access for high-end manufactured products and services. Of course, those industries in the developed economies which found themselves in the crosshairs of Chinese competition, and for many individual firms which found themselves displaced from their domestic supply chains, China's emergence meant, at best, a painful restructuring and a race to apply technology to raise productivity. But for the global economy as a whole, it meant a prolonged rise in trend productivity growth as lower-skilled manufacturing was progressively outsourced to Chinese factories, and manufacturers in developed countries increasingly became importers of simpler products and components, while largely retaining high value-added products and the design and marketing control of their products for themselves. But China's rapid rise up the value curve from being a manufacturer of components and simple goods to becoming a supplier of complex finished products and a major developer of new technologies has changed the equation. Developed country politicians, happy enough to see low-value manufacturing jobs displaced to low-cost Asian suppliers, feel differently about their high-tech sectors. The US awoke from a strategic slumber to belatedly recognize that China's rising economic power leads inexorably to rising strategic power, that the technologies of a modern digital economy have direct military application, and that in some areas the US was struggling to maintain its lead. From around 2015, I saw increasing evidence of the US system regretting its embrace of China as an economic player, as a catastrophic strategic mistake, and attempting to restrict opportunities for China's further economic growth, and in particular for its access to sophisticated technology. But it was too late. China had already become one of the world's technology powerhouses and a formidable competitor. And increasingly, that competitiveness is not driven by low-cost labor, as China embraces and in many cases leads automation and digitization in manufacturing. Globalization was not, of course, just a China story. Look at the increasingly complex and sophisticated supply chains in the auto industry, in Europe, in Asia, and in North America, where components and sub-assemblies may cross and recross international borders multiple times before ending up in a finished vehicle. Strategic alarm at China's increasing dominance of swathes of the global economy has undoubtedly been a major impetus for the reversal of globalization trends. But there are other factors at work. Complex supply chains and just-in-time manufacturing plants are always a trade-off between economic efficiency and industrial resilience. For years, the fractions of a penny that could be saved on components became the difference between access to competitive export markets and slow economic decline. But the COVID pandemic changed the metrics of industry. Suddenly, the single-sourced component from a factory in Wuhan that saved 40 cents on the cost of a $30,000 car didn't look like such a smart call, as production lines ground to a halt and part-finished vehicles piled up in stockyards. Countries with no pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity saw their vulnerability brutally exposed as exporting countries' governments blocked exports of medicines to prioritize domestic populations. And major food importers, such as the Gulf countries, were strategically wrong-footed by similar export bans on foodstuffs. The immediate reaction was a lurch towards valuing resilience over efficiency, which stopped the growth of globalization in its tracks, as governments, shareholders, and customers alike demanded guarantees of continuity of production. But there is another longer-term trend that has helped to accelerate deglobalization. Increasingly, smart manufacturing techniques are reducing economies of scale with flexible, robotized production lines capable of efficient small batch and even bespoke production. The customized production that has been a feature of auto plants for years is coming to other sectors right now, courtesy of digitization, AI, and advanced robotics. Supply chain resilience concerns, rising labor costs in Asia, declining labor content in products generally, increasing awareness of the carbon costs of long-distance freight, and the opportunity to bypass economies of scale with close-to-the-customer digitized and customized production have all created powerful new business arguments against the traditional economic case for globalized production. The combination of economics, security concerns, political pressure, and geopolitical risk has effectively halted and then reversed 3 decades of accelerating globalization. But of course, the world is not composed of 140-odd completely economically independent countries. A significant proportion of the world's markets are organized into trading blocs: the EU, ASEAN, the GCC, Mercosur, and the CPTPP, for example. A key question is whether these blocs can mobilize sufficient trust between their members to successfully domesticize globalization by seeking to specialize within the bloc. If they can do so, they will salvage some of the enduring economic benefits of globalization, even as the system fragments into regionalization. But the early evidence is mixed. For some industries, regionalization or nearshoring may prove a happy compromise between security and efficiency. But I fear the world has passed a point of no return in respect of certain strategic products and services where politics now dictates that nothing short of national autonomy will do, whatever the cost. For Turkey, there is the tantalizing prospect that nearshoring by EU businesses as a better trade-off against cost than the absolute security of domestic production within the EU will allow Turkish production to displace cheaper Chinese options in the EU supply chain mix. Similarly for Mexico in relation to the US, if the politics can be overcome. Turning to protectionism and tariffs, the protectionists have been on the march since COVID and are currently in the ascendant globally. However effectively the free trade rearguard is mounted, the simplistic logic of protectionism is likely to prove seductive in a populist-dominated political era. At least until we run out of people to do them, the cry of more jobs is likely to resonate in political debate. Additional jobs are tangible. The higher costs and lower quality for consumers that protectionism implies are more nuanced and difficult to identify. Mr. Trump is, of course, the arch protagonist of tariffs. The world rightly has two problems with his policy approach. The first is about process, the arbitrariness, the lack of notice, the frequent reversals, and the use of tariffs as a generic policy weapon against any country that the president doesn't like. These process failings create uncertainty, which drives cost and slows decision-making and thus growth across the global economy. The second is the policy itself. Mr. Trump has introduced an additional dimension over and above the traditional protectionist lines by arguing that the cost of tariffs is paid by foreigners and that tariff revenues can substitute for domestic taxes. I'm afraid American consumers are likely to find out the hard way, albeit in slower time, that it is they who will be bearing at least part of the direct costs of tariffs, as well as all of the indirect costs of domestic producers raising prices to fatten margins, the choice of products available decreasing, and the pace of technical innovation slowing under the loss of competitive pressure. It remains the case that tariffs are generally good news for producers and bad news for consumers. And in the case of Mr. Trump, while it's clear that he understands the interests of business, it is not at all clear to me that he understands the interests of consumers. But, the protectionist argues, consumers are also producers whose jobs are being protected by these tariffs. But that is simply not true in an economy where manufacturing and agriculture together account for less than 11% of output. 89% of American consumers will see no jobs benefit, even in the narrow terms of Mr. Trump's definition. Which takes us to the strangest aspect of Mr. Trump's tariff obsession. It is focused entirely on manufactured goods and agricultural produce. Across all developed economies, those sectors typically account for substantially less than 15% of output combined. Mr. Trump analyzes in minute detail each individual trading partner's goods trade balance with America, while totally ignoring the US's huge surplus on services trade with the rest of the world. This myopia leads to an economic policy focused disproportionately on manufacturing rather than on maximizing total output. A protectionist tariff regime which encourages misallocation of labor and capital to the protected manufacturing and agricultural sectors is emphatically not in the interest of the US economy as a whole. An economy which struggles to compete across the board might be forgiven for being seduced into believing protectionism is a solution. But an economy with the advantages of the US across pretty much all sectors has no excuse for such an economically damaging adventure. The only economic justification for high tariffs in the US is to protect against manifestly unfair below-cost dumping or to nurture genuinely strategic infant industries on a strictly time-limited basis. Whatever happens now to future US trade policy after Mr. Trump, the spectre of arbitrary tariffs will hang over it and act as a damper on investment decisions at home and abroad for decades to come. Already, multiple suboptimal investments by foreign companies in the US have been announced simply as insurance policies against tariffs. Mr. Trump will no doubt score these as the measures of success of his policies, but the easy wins are short-term, the longer-term damage comes later. The bottom line is that the last 15 months' chaos over tariffs has created uncertainty, which has raised the required rate of return for new investment in manufacturing, both in the US and abroad. I want to conclude my remarks by saying something about energy markets, arguably the part of the economy most susceptible to geopolitical disruption. Decarbonisation, security of supply and affordability are, and perhaps always will be, in tension. Until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Europeans had been primarily focused on decarbonisation while fretting about its impact on energy affordability and industrial competitiveness. The aftermath of the Russian invasion shifted the priority to security at any cost, within the context of a geopolitically motivated decision to break the dependency on Russian energy supply. European countries rewrote their rules, overrode their decarbonisation targets, and splurged public money to secure supplies